when a disruption hits the market or industry, be it the COVID-19 pandemic, industrial revolution, the 2008 financial crisis, whatever it is, when it hits, people talk about adapt or evolve, adapt or die. The biggest question that leaders have is, how do we respond? So I'm going to share 3 things that you have to do. It's actually 4 things that you need to do as a crisis leader, a leader that is leading in the verge of crisis. All right. The first thing that you're going to do, you have to resolve, and we're going to use COVID, the pandemic, as like a frame of reference. First thing, crisis is happening. The COVID-19 just hit, right? So you have to touch the ground. The first thing you need to touch the ground and look for the immediate challenges and concerns that this disruption, this crisis, this pandemic is presenting to your customers, employees, and supply chain, so that you can resolve them first. So when it comes to customers, you can ask yourself questions such as, how can I stay in touch with my customers and remain relevant to them when they don't need or desire my services? Right? Because when COVID-19 came, it also changed when it was locked down and there was a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. People were losing jobs. So there was price value, perception was changing. People who used to be loyal to brands, certain brands, no longer cared about brands. They cared about the budget. So now it happens that some of the products that you were selling were not regarded as essential services, essential products. So price value changes. Look, what's essential and what's not essential changed in the minds of customers. So now the question is, because we want you to resolve the challenges that are being presented to your customers. You don't just abandon your customers. So how can you stay in touch with your customers and remain relevant to them when they don't need or desire your services, right? Second thing, when it comes to customers, how can you inspire loyalty in your customers, right? Let's say, for example, you were selling liquor and alcohol, right? And lockdown in South Africa, it was closed down, right? No alcohol, the sale of alcohol was not allowed. So as a company that is in the liquor space, the alcohol space, right? How can you inspire loyalty in your customers? What can you do other than offering alcohol? Could you come up with a program that shows that you are with those that are so deeply affected by COVID-19? Could you donate? Could you give them whatever? What can you do? How can you inspire loyalty, right? You're trying to resolve the immediate challenges that are that your customers are experiencing, right? So how can you stay in touch with them and remain relevant to them even though they don't need your services or they don't desire them? And how can you inspire loyalty in your customers? 2, when it comes to employees now, we're trying to resolve immediate challenges and concerns, that the disruption, the COVID-19, whatever the disruption is presenting to your employees. So, right. So you're asking yourself, it's the question of, what can I do to make sure that my employees stay productive, right? So let's talk about COVID-19. COVID-19, no one was safe, right, with COVID-19, right? Whether it's from contracting the disease, the virus, or it was from losing a job, right? So your employees were anxious, whether they were anxious because they could lose their job. You could be downsizing or something like that. They could hear from you to say that you'll be downsizing or something like that, or maybe somebody's sick, somebody close to them, or just anxiety from this collective anxiety. So meaning the productivity level was impacted. So now the question is, what can you do to make sure that they stay productive, right? Whether they're working from home or on site, what can you do, right? That's the first question, right? And second thing is, how can you support the human element of your employees? Mind you, your employees, before they're your employees, they're human beings. So anxiety, you have to care about them being anxious. You need to care about them being freaked out. The COVID-19 is happening, the looting was happening. How can you be there? How can you support the human element in them? Because when you want that assignment, that project completed, or whatever, those KPIs, you're expecting them not necessarily from an employee, but from a human being who's stressed out, who's anxious, who's freaking out, right? People are dying. right? So how can you support the human element in them, right? So this is where we're talking about empathy, empathic leadership. You need to start showing compassion to them, right? What can you do to show that? Can you do some mental health check-in? Can you like procure some mental health experts to talk to them? Can you give them some sort of incentives where they can see psychologists? Or how can you support them, right? Could you give them some incentives around health insurance, or what? Maybe free groceries, some just for that time being. What can you do to support them, right? And now, how can you adjust? The question of how can I adjust my workforce deployment to maximize profitability and productivity, right? So now that you've tried to resolved the immediate challenges when it comes to employees and customers, and then you need to look into the supply chain, right? During crisis, those are uncertain times. When COVID-19 first hit in March, it was March 2020 in South Africa, and the lockdown started happening. We didn't know what was going to happen next. We just like operating blindly. We didn't know that even we get to a point where by now we can walk on the streets without masks. So it's uncertain times, right? So meaning historical data can no longer be a sole guide for demand planning. The demand and supply is no longer that predictable during a crisis or chaos or disruption, right? So you need to start asking yourself questions like, what challenges are facing our value chain, suppliers, manufacturers, logistics, salespeople, right? And how those challenges are affecting your business. And how can you restructure your operating model and business model, right? So you need to understand that what used to work may not work right now. So you need to now try fixing those. So if you're in a business that depended on, if your industry, in South African context, the product that you were providing, that you're selling, was regarded as essential, but where it is coming from, it is not regarded as essential, then you see that there's a gap in your supply chain, in your value chain, all right? So you need to check if everything is still intact. And if it's not intact, how can you now change? How can you reform? How can you restructure your operating model, right? For example, if you used to you're in the event space, right? So meaning it's face-to-face, it's meet and greet, it's networking sessions, they happen live in some facility somewhere. So, and events industry, right? So you're not allowed to go out. So what can you do? We saw what happened in South Africa with the entertainment space. So we started having the lockdown house party that was happening. So the party was brought to people's homes via TV, right? So in the event space, that's where the virtual work started to come in. That's why the Zoom started to be used. Most of us knew about Zoom, had Zoom, but we never really used it as much as we started using it during the pandemic. So this is some of the restructuring and the reforming that you have to do to change your business model and operating model. Check if everything's still intact, if it's still working. If it's not working, don't get attached. Don't get attached, adapt, go with times. Otherwise, you're going to get thrown out of business by disruption, by COVID-19. So now that you've resolved the immediate challenges that are faced by your customers, employees in the supply chain, it's time now to build resilience. That's number 2, how you respond. First, you resolve. 2, you have to build resilience. So you need to start addressing the near-term challenges and work on a plan to stabilize your business, right? Resolving it was about the immediate challenges, but the changes, adaptation doesn't just happen just like that. You have to create stability. There has to be stability, right? So you need to start building resilience so that whatever changes you're making sticks, right? So to build resilience for your business, this is where you start. First thing, you need to evaluate the risks and threats. Ask yourself questions such as, what threats do the changes in the macro external environment pose on your business? What threats do changes in the external environment pose on my business, the changes that are happening, right? The fact that now it's lockdown, how does that affect my business, right? Certain sectors and industries are not essential. They're closed down, they're on lockdown too. Certain operations are on lockdown, employees are home. How does this change affect me, impact my business, right? So then you look at then two, you have to, after identifying the key risks and threats, you have to now evaluate the possible short and long-term scenarios and derive implications. So now that you have checked the threats that the changes the macro environment poses on your business, you need to now ask yourself, what implications will these identified risks and threats have on my business, both in the short term and the long term, right? The lockdown, what will be the implications on my business, right? Both in the short term and the long term, right? The online, the remote working, and after evaluating the possible short and long term scenarios and implications, right, based on the threats and risks that you have identified, now you have to formulate a portfolio of interventions. Ask yourself, how will you defend your business? How can I defend my business now that we have all these threats, that are affecting my business, how I'm doing business, they're threatening my business model, my operating model. How can I defend my business? What actions can I take to ensure that cash is flowing in, customers are retained and satisfied, and employees are protected, business systems are in place? So here's the thing. In your strategy, after you've identified the risk and the threats and everything, remember the key things, the three things that are important. You're protecting your customers, protecting your employees, serving your customers, and then stabilizing the business, right? So when you formulate this portfolio of interventions, you are asking yourself how you can defend your business. You ask yourself, what actions can you take to ensure that cash is flowing in? Because you need to stay in business. The key thing the reason why you're a crisis leader is because you need to keep the business in business, right? Otherwise, the disruption induced, the disruption induced by COVID-19, whatever it is, whatever the factor is, could actually keep you out of business. So the key thing is to keep in business, and keeping in business means the P&Ls and stuff, right? So what actions can you take to make sure that the cash is flowing in, revenue still being generated? One, right? We're looking at revenue generation, right? And two, what actions can you take to ensure that customers are retained and satisfied? You don't want to be that guy who don't care about customers and say, oh, we'll get more, and you just abandon your customers in this tough time. And then three is employees. Ask yourself, what actions can I take to ensure that employees are protected? You need to care. Don't be that guy who don't care about employees. Like I said, your employees, before they're your employees, are human beings. So you have to protect them. You don't just want to save yourself only. When you build an ark, you have to think about them also. You need to bring them in too. So what actions can you take to ensure that they're protected, right? For example, with COVID-19, anxiety was just rife, right? It was just a lot, too much to take it. People were getting sick. So how can you protect them? The insecurities, job security, income security, they were just freaking out. And when people are freaking out, you won't get results. Productivity levels will just go down, right? So how can you protect them? And this is where you're going to realize that protecting your employees, employee engagement, is actually good for your business. When you care, when you show emotion, empathy towards your employees, you're actually helping your business. It's good for your business because when you take care of them, when they feel appreciated, they're going to show up for you. How can you show up for a person if they don't care how you're doing? You just lost your parent, right? This is a pandemic. And now that you have taken action, you've derived actions that you can take to ensure that your employees are protected. Now it's a question of what actions can you take to ensure that their business systems are in place. So here we're talking about the shifts. you know things have changed. You realize that now, okay, people prefer online, so there's no way that people are going to walk into your store. So you need to have some sort of an e-commerce system so that business keeps going. So you need to make sure such systems are in place. So if you change into remote working, you need to make sure that those systems are working, right? How are you going to make it happen, right? That was the second thing in terms of how do we respond during a disruption or crisis. First, we resolve, and then we build resilience. Three, we now reform. After we've resolved and built resilience, it's time to reform now. And you need to start leaning in onto the next normal, whatever the new normal is, whatever the trends have signaled to say this is how things are going to change, right? This is where we're talking about adapting, right? So you need to start determining how you will serve your customers' raw needs in a changed world, right? You're operating in a constantly changing market environment that is disruption prone. So now it's a question, how will you serve your customers' raw needs in a changed world? It may be how you used to serve them will no longer will work in the new normal, the next normal, in the changed world, right? So you need to seek out signals of changing customer expectations, right? And then adjust your go-to-market and distribution models based on these new behaviors. All right. So the big questions that you need to ponder on in the COVID-19, case in point, COVID-19. So as governments reflecting on the crisis and are reflecting on the crisis and start enacting new policies and that to protect, in quest to protect citizens and ensure preparedness for whatever that may come, right? You need to now think about how the private sector regulations might change, right? You need to start thinking forward now. So the government is changing, the macro environment is changing, the political landscape is changing, things are changing on quest to protect the citizens. So how will the changes in the new policies that the government enact impact the private sector regulations? And then now you ask this question, this is an important question. What is the big idea that could shape our industry and company for the next decade, right? This is the changes that are happening, the trends that are happening. So what's the big idea that could shape our industry and company for the next decade, right? Ask yourself that. That's innovation now. It's now to let those creativity to go on, right? So what's the big idea? Obviously, it's the changed world. So if you know any innovative company, think of what would Google, whatever innovative company, what would Amazon do if they were in our industry? What would they be thinking about? How would they change how they do business? How would they innovate their business model? So what is the big idea that could shape our industry and company for the next decade? And start working from there. And then start thinking forward. Ask what multi-year trends have been irrevocably pulled forward. So those trends that you knew, like for example, digital economy, virtual work and stuff like that, have been there since forever. But because of the pandemic, online shopping and stuff like that, and digital economy, digital e-commerce has been accelerated. So it's something that we knew about. We're like, oh no, not yet. The fourth industrial revolution technologies, we're like, okay, it's there, but you know what? Not yet. But because of the pandemic, it was accelerated. So think about the trends that you know of, but you're thinking, maybe in the next decade. Think about them. Which of those trends have been accelerated, have been brought forward, right? And what are the new trends that we need to confront? Of those trends that have been brought forward and the new ones, which ones do you need to be confronting right now? Because they're not going anywhere. And you don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be that guy that you say, no. You don't want to be BlackBerry. You don't want to be Nokia. You don't want to say, we did everything that we could. We did everything right, but for some reason we didn't win. We didn't get it right. You don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be Blockbuster. You don't want to be Yahoo. All right? So think about the trends that have been put forward and the ones that they came now as a result of disruptions, and think of the ones that you should be confronting right now so that you can adapt. So now that you've resolved immediate challenges presented to your customers, employees, and your supply chain, right? And now you've built resilience, and now you've also reformed your organization to make sure that it thrives in the new normal, right? It is time to lead. You're a crisis leader. So now you need to start leading. And your crisis leader is defined by two things: brave leadership and courageous culture. As a leader that is going to win during a crisis and beyond it, you have to be brave and courageous. Meaning you may need to break the rules that paralyze change and innovation. You may need to also start confronting your own stuff, like your own leadership style and management style. All right? We talked about empathy being one of the key things that we need to help our employees be productive, especially during a crisis, especially like we saw with COVID-19. If you were a person who used not to care about employees being engaged and showing emotions and stuff like that, it may be like a time you realize that, oh, I need to start being more, emotional, empathic, and compassionate towards my employees, because these are human beings too. So you need to start being brave and courageous, because that's what defines a crisis leader: brave leadership and courageous culture.